Hello and welcome to my channel if this is the first video of mine that you are watching, but if it is not, welcome back. Today, as you can tell by the title, I am going to be filming the 2024 Whiskies, or otherwise known as my best books of 2024. I filmed this for the first time last year and I had so much fun combing through my Goodreads and my Storygraph to find books that fit into the categories I chose and just reflecting back on my year of reading. So I wanted to film a video in the same format for my 2024 books. And if you didn't watch the 2023 Whiskies, which I understand because it was an hour long, I will link last year's video somewheres on this video or down in the description below. But the basic premise is I have chosen 11 categories from best short read, best historical romance, best plot twist, best nonfiction book, and then I looked through the books that I've read in the past year and I have chosen 3 to 5 books per category that I thought were my best books in that category for the past year. I'll briefly touch on each nomination before I reveal which book was the best of that category for me from this past year. And then the whole reason that this video is called The Whiskies is because I will crown my best overall read of 2024 with a whiskey that I have picked out. It's a Canadian whiskey. And I'll discuss a little bit more about that best overall book while pouring out a wee dram of whiskey and toasting to the end of this year and the beginning of 2025. One final thing to note is that similar to perhaps other award season shows, the books that I am selecting from are not my reads from January 1 to December 31st. I'm actually filming this on December 31st this year, but I wanted to give myself a little bit more leeway last year. So the books that I have selected for the categories of the 2024 Whiskies are books that I have read between December 1st, 2023 and November 30th, 2024. But I think that is everything. I've got my notebooks handy here and I have a cup of coffee for sustenance. So let's dive right into the categories. My first category is Best Debut or New to Me Authors, because the last 2 years I have read a tremendous amount of new to me authors that haven't necessarily been debut authors. I've just been very late to the game, which is very telling of me in just general. But for this category, for 2024, I am nominating Diana Quincy, who is a historical romance author. I adore myself some historical romance. It is my comfort genre. It's what I fall back to when I need something just cozy and comforting that I know the beats of the plot it's going to follow, and I adore historical romance. I read Diana Quincy for the very first time back at the beginning of this year, and I loved her writing, her world building, and also the diverse characters within her books. So first nomination goes to Diana Quincy. The second new to me author is Kingfisher. Obviously, I am very, very late to the game with Kingfisher because they are so beloved all over the internet, but I had only ever really known of Kingfisher in that horror context. I knew they wrote horror, and horror isn't really my cup of tea. But this year I discovered that Kingfisher also writes fantasy romance, which is very much my kind of tea. So I discovered Kingfisher for the first time this year, fell in love with their worlds, their character building. So really happy that I discovered Kingfisher this year. I also discovered Lyla Sage this year, who is the author for some contemporary cowboy romances. And I did not think that I would be a contemporary cowboy romance type of woman, but the Blue Rebel Ranch series really got me hook, line, and sinker. I was initially drawn to these books based on the cover because I love that comic book-esque cartoonish design. Then the fourth best new to me author is Danielle L. Jensen. Jensen is beloved online by different book communities, but is not an author that I have read anything by until I saw A Fate Inked in Blood come available at my local library. I immediately borrowed it and dove right in. It is a Norse-inspired fantasy romance. I will say I don't remember there being anything that caught me by surprise. It really did follow some familiar plot beats and plot journeys, but I really enjoyed our characters and I really enjoyed the way that Jensen was building the world bit by bit. And then finally, the fifth and last nomination for Best Debut or New to Me Author is an actual debut author, and that is Hannah Kaner with the Fallen Gods series. The first book in that series is God Killer, followed by the sequel Sunbringer. And this, I would say, is the rare case in which I think I enjoyed the sequel more than the first book, because God Killer does have those kinks of a debut publication. That said, I absolutely loved this fantasy world following multiple characters. But so those are my 5 new to me largely, and also a debut author. But the winner of this category for 2024 is going to be Kingfisher. I can't believe that I am so late to the bandwagon. Well, I can believe that I'm so late to the bandwagon, but I'm kicking myself because I have enjoyed reading Kingfisher's bibliography so much this past year, and I wish I would have discovered or given their writing a chance earlier so that I could be rereading these books now and not just experiencing them for the first time. But by far, even though I read a lot of new authors for me this past year, Kingfisher is the author that I am most excited to have discovered in 2024. Then the next category that I'm going to chat about is Best Short Read. I believe last year this category was any book less than 200 pages, but I did not read a lot of novella and very short books this past year, so I've bumped up the limit to this category to any book under 300 pages. Most of the books that I read fall within that 300 to 500 page count, so a book that is less than 300 pages is still a shorter read for me. So the first nomination in this category is going to be Nettle and Bone by Kingfisher, and this book was 270 pages, at least the edition that I read. And it is a fairy tale-esque, retelling-esque, with a lot of dark and macabre imagery woven throughout. It's very hard to describe this little book without giving anything away, but essentially, rather than set out to marry a prince, our protagonist sets out to murder a prince, and then she collects some ragtag members. They form a group and they set out on this quest to murder a prince in order to save her sister. I loved Nettle and Bone. Then my second nomination for this category is my shortest book of 2024 at only 101 pages, and that is The Governess Affair by Courtney Milan. This is a prequel novella to her brother's Sinister series, which is a historical romance series. And a massive content warning that I want to attach to this prequel novella and to this nomination in general is that this novella deals a lot with sexual assault and the trauma that can follow sexual assault, which is not something that I'm usually very keen on reading. But I think that Milan did a really, really excellent job with so few pages to work with. My third nomination is one that I do have a physical copy of, and that is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, and this edition here is only 288 pages. I feel as if most people have read The Midnight Library, but this is a contemporary literary fiction book that deals with the meaning of life and death. There are significant themes of depression and suicide. I'm struggling with how to describe this book without revealing any spoilers. So it is a heavy read, but after I finished The Midnight Library, it was late at night in bed, which is when I often finish my books. And I remember just closing it and letting out a huge, deep of satisfaction at the ending. And that's always a good sign with a book, for me at least. The fourth nomination for my best short read of 2024 was 254 pages, and that is Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater, which is a fantasy romance that takes place in Regency England, and it is a world in which the Fae intermingle with human, and people kind of know they exist, but they kind of are starting to lose that faith. I love the setting of this world. I loved the concept of our protagonist only having half a soul, and I really enjoyed the relationship that blossomed between our main human female character and our main male Fae character. And then finally, my last nomination for Best Short Read of 2024 is going to be Paladin's Hope by T. Kingfisher, which was only 258 pages, at least the edition that I read, which makes it by far the shortest book within the Saint of Steel series. And I will say that its brevity is apparent within the book. Even though it was the shortest book within the Saint of Steel series, it was still a 5-star read for me. But my winner of Best Short Read of 2024 is going to be The Governess Affair by Courtney Milan. I kind of hinted at this earlier, but with only 101 pages, what Milan was able to accomplish within this book is truly extraordinary in my personal opinion. They depicted the trauma that can follow sexual assault more realistically with only 100 pages than I have seen authors do within 400, 500 pages. I was just truly, truly taken aback with how much character development and how fully fleshed Milan's characters felt with only 100 pages, that this by far has to be my best short read of 2024. And that leads me perfectly into my next category, which is Best Historical Romance. And again, I have 5 nominations for this category. My first nomination is an author I've already spoken about, and that is Diana Quincy with the Clandestine Affairs series. And I believe of that trilogy, my favorite book was the sequel. Again, I'm not usually a sequel type of reader, but I've read some amazing sequels this past year. And The Viscount Made Me Do It is the second book in that trilogy. I absolutely fell in love with the characters. I love how stubborn they were, and I love the banter that ensued from that stubbornness. Again, I absolutely adore historical romance books, but it is a subgenre of romance in particular that can be incredibly lacking with its representation and doesn't often include a lot of diverse rep. So that is something that I'm always looking to find more of within that historical romance genre, so I can scratch that itch in my brain, but I'm not just reading about 20 white characters falling in love again and again and again. So I adored The Viscount Made Me Do It by Diana Quincy, and I also adored the second nomination in this category, which is The Duke Who Didn't by Courtney Milan again. And I actually found this book from an article I wrote a couple of years ago about historical romance books to read if you really enjoyed Bridgerton. And I specifically remember trying to source books for that list that included more diverse rep. So we follow two Chinese English characters that are in this really idyllic village within the countryside. It's so endearing. This village has a lot of representation, a lot of diverse representation, and it's just smack dab in Regency England, but because it's so far in the countryside, no one really cares. Our main male character is a duke who doesn't tell anyone he's a duke. And our main female character, Chloe, is very much a type A personality. She lives her life based off lists and organization, and of course the duke in this scenario is not a very organized fellow, and it was just so endearing watching the two of them admit their feelings for one another and take the steps to develop their relationship into something romantic. My third nomination for this category is from an author that I know and absolutely adore, and that is Sarah MacLean, and it is the third book in her Hell's Bells series, Knockout. Again, we have that dichotomy with our main characters in which one is super prim and proper and follows all of the rules, and our other character is very much not that and likes to bend the rules and flout the rules and carve their own path. But one thing that I love with MacLean is that they subvert a lot of tropes. So in Knockout, our prim and proper character is our male protagonist, who is a member of the police force. He is part of Scotland Yard, and our female character is the one who is much more prone to flout the rules. Imogen and Thomas were so endearing, and again, watching them admit their feelings for one another and then figuring out how or if they were going to pursue those feelings was so endearing, so entertaining. Then my fourth nomination for Best Historical Romance of 2024 is The Secret Lives of Country Gentlemen by K.J. Charles. This is a male-male romance, and again, it takes place during Regency England, but out in the countryside. So the rationale is just no one really cares what happens in the countryside, and we have two characters who are outwardly very, very different, and there's a theme throughout my nominations for this book, but we are following them having to admit their feelings for one another and having to overcome some obstacles in order to pursue a relationship, and watching the two of them decide that the love they were feeling, the safety they were feeling from the other character was worth the risk to pursue was so endearing. And I loved The Secret Lives of Country Gentlemen because there was also a mystery woven throughout, which is not always the case with the historical romances that I pick up, but this mystery in particular really had me invested and interested, and it felt as if the stakes were a little bit higher than some other historical romances that I've read. I really believed the villain in this book could do some serious harm and damage. In fact, he kind of did, but I really believed and was following along with the anticipation and the threat of violence throughout this book. Really adored Secret Lives of Country Gentlemen. And then finally, my last nomination for Best Historical Romance of 2024 is another Sarah MacLean title, and that is Brazen and the Beast, which is the second book, again, in the Bare Knuckle Bastards series. The Brazen and the Beast, as you might gather by the title, is a very loose retelling of Beauty and the Beast, which is something that will always get me. So without even describing the book farther, I am going to say that Brazen and the Beast was my best historical romance of 2024. Beauty and the Beast retellings, that concept is just something that will get me hook, line, and sinker every single time, and MacLean's rendition of this concept, of this trope, was no exception. I am obviously filming this in December in Canada, and there's a very real likelihood that I'm going to run out of light before I finish these categories. But the fourth category that I have nominations for is Best Fantasy of 2024. And this is obviously quite a big one, but I'll try to go through it as quickly as I possibly can. The first book that I'm nominating is The Lions of Al-Rassan by Gavriel K. If you have watched any of my previous videos, you likely know that I wanted 2024 to be my year of K. I did not finish this man's bibliography this past year. That was a very lofty goal, perhaps stupidly lofty in hindsight, but I obviously read as many books of his bibliography as I could, and I enjoyed all of them, hence why The Lions of Al-Rassan is in this category. And I did kind of shoehorn it into this category because I don't have a general best historical magical realism category. And if you go onto Goodreads, The Lions of Al-Rassan is tagged with fantasy. I would not say that this is a true proper fantasy. They aren't killing dragons or anything of that sort, or throwing fireball in this book, but there are threads of magical realism woven throughout. As is the case with many of Kay's books, there is this hint of otherworldly god or gods that are kind of playing with the characters and interfering with the characters and their paths. So The Lions of Al-Rassan is my first nomination for Best Fantasy of 2024, even if it doesn't necessarily fit the description of fantasy as most of us regard it. But then my second nomination is a debut fantasy, and this I believe is young adult, but I have some questions about tagging this as young adult. It is Immortal Dark by Tigest Girma. I read this book back in October, I believe, and I loved it. It is a vampire story, and I just think the world needs more vampire stories. It scratches an itch in my brain that Twilight carved into it at a very formative age. So there will always be a part of me that loves a vampire story. Not only is this a vampire story, but it is also a dark academia story. I will say that Immortal Dark did suffer from the common pitfalls of many debuts in that the world building felt a little bit clunky at the beginning, as did some of the character development and building. But the story that Girma began in this book, I am so excited to see them continue that in its sequel. And it was just something new and different that I hadn't read a lot of recently. So I think Immortal Dark was one of my best fantasy reads of 2024, and I would highly recommend it. My third nomination for this category is another K book, and that is Sailing to Sarantium. And this, again, it's not outright fantasy. It's more alternative history, magical realism, but the gods play a slightly more prominent role within Sailing to Sarantium than, say, lions, I would say. So I'm still putting it in fantasy. Goodreads still labels it as fantasy. And even though Kay doesn't love his books labeled as fantasy, it is the category in which his books best fit for me personally in the Whiskies. And I will take any excuse that I can to talk about Kay. Then the fourth nomination for Best Fantasy is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. And this is like a fantasy sci-fi-esque book. And I loved Gideon the Ninth. I read this again, it was like the end of September, beginning of October, and it was the perfect spooky season read for me as someone who doesn't love horror, but there was a fair bit of gore in this book. Obviously, with our main characters being necromancers, there's also heavy themes of death throughout this book, but I thought the world that Muir introduced was so intriguing, and I absolutely cannot wait to read the next book, the sequel in this series. Then the fifth and final nomination that I have for Best Fantasy of 2024 is Faebound by Saara El-Arifi. Similar to Immortal Dark, I found the world building and character development of Faebound a little bit clunky from the start, and that did prevent me from fully investing in the plights of our characters. And while I basically predicted every plot twist that took place, and while I didn't absolutely love the romantic partnerships, not that I didn't love the romantic partnerships, but I didn't find them so believable. I didn't buy into that all-consuming lust or love. Despite all of that, I really enjoyed Faebound, and this is another book in which the sequel is coming out in 2025, and I think I'm going to pre-order this sequel because I really want to read it sooner rather than later. But those are my 5 nominations for Best Fantasy of 2024, and the winner of Best Fantasy for me is going to be The Lions of Al-Rassan. Again, I just needed an opportunity to talk about this book. There are hints of fantasy elements throughout this book, and again, Goodreads describes it as a fantasy, historical, alternate reality, magical realism book. So that's fantastical enough for me. I adore The Lions of Al-Rassan. I've spoken about it on my channel previously, and I have no doubt that I will speak about it again in the future. There is a love triangle of sorts within Lions, and that is usually a trope that I absolutely loathe. But Kay is able to depict love and relationships and the messiness of relationships and love so freaking well. I adore the way that he depicts all forms of love. It's the same reason why I absolutely adore A Song for Arbonne by Kay, which might have been my book of 2023, if I'm recalling. It definitely won an award in 2023, probably Best Fantasy. But I absolutely adore Kay's writing, and the way that he depicts different relationships within these fully fleshed worlds is one of those reasons. So The Lions of Al-Rassan by Gavriel Kay was my Best Fantasy book of 2024. Now, onto my fifth category for the 2024 Whiskies. And I've already had to stop filming so that I could briefly and quickly charge my camera battery. So let's hope that this daylight lasts for at least a few more hours. But the fifth category is Best Fantasy Romance. And this is obviously an incredibly popular category and gets a lot of people fired up. I personally hate the marketing name that has been used over the past year and a bit to describe fantasy romance, romantic fantasy books. It just gives me the ick. There's something about that word in particular, kind of like moist for some people. I just don't like it. So my best fantasy romance nominations, of course, I am basic, and that is okay because the first nomination is going to be Iron Flame by Rebecca Yarros. I get the hype. I totally love it. I mean, we have enemies to lovers, we have dragons, we have mystery and intrigue and romance and passion. All things that I absolutely adore within my fiction and within my fantasy. So yes, I am on the fourth wing Iron Flame hype train. My next nomination for this category is quite a bit different from Iron Flame because it is not explicit at all from my recollection. I'm pretty sure this is a closed door romance. But there is romance that flows throughout it. And I found Warrior of the Wild by Trisha Lemonseller to be a beautiful story about love and loyalty, and not just romantic love, but familial love as well. I loved Warrior of the Wild, and I found it to be a really endearing story with a message of hope and strength and perseverance woven throughout. My third nomination for this category is a more explicit fantasy romance, and that is Paladin's Grace by T. Kingfisher. There is sex that takes place on the page within this book, same as in Iron Flame. But again, I adored the romance that took place within Paladin's Grace. We have these two characters who don't think that they are worthy or deserving of love, and watching them realize that they are, because everyone is, and watching them take the risk to love again after they had each been hurt in the past from devotion, from love. It was so heartwarming and inspiring. I really loved watching their love flourish and blossom for each other. And then also, yeah, we had some mystery, some murder mystery taking place in the background, and there were larger works at play within this universe by Kingfisher. My fourth nomination is A River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross, and this is a Scottish-inspired fantasy romance. The fantasy in this book is a little bit more subtle. It's much more akin to Scottish folklore, but I loved A River Enchanted for, again, just a slightly different fantasy romance. It's not a high epic fantasy, it's more a soft, subtle, cozy fantasy, even though there are topics and themes of grief and loss and depression throughout. I wouldn't say it is a stereotypical cozy fantasy, but I found the setting of this duology to be incredibly comforting. I just wanted to roam those heather-lined moors and hills myself and hope that I did not stumble across a fairy path. Then my final nomination for Best Fantasy Romance of 2024 is one that squeezed its way into the nomination period because I finished Servant of Earth by Saara Hawley on November 30th exactly. So this book just barely made the cutoff in order to be nominated for this year's Whiskies, and I'm so glad that it did. There's a theme in fantasy romance at the moment. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but a lot of the books have to do with fae and fairies, and Servant of the Earth is no exception. Holly did not reinvent the wheel with Servant of Earth. It does follow those very familiar plot points that a lot of us will recognize and anticipate in fantasy in general, and especially within fantasy romance, I would say. But I'm okay with that. I don't need the wheel to be reinvented with each and every book that I pick up. I just want to enjoy the journey, and I very much enjoyed the journey with Servant of Earth, and I absolutely want to know what comes next for our character and how she navigates the future complications that are going to arise. So those are my nominations for Best Fantasy Romance of 2024, and the winner of this category for me has to be, drumroll please, Paladin's Grace by T. Kingfisher. If you have heard me speak about this book at any point within 2024, you know how much I adored it. I loved Stephen and Grace's relationship within Paladin's Grace. I loved the world that Kingfisher created. So it has to win Best Fantasy Romance for me. But on to my next category, which is Best Pairing. Obviously, I read a lot of romance books and I read about a lot of couples, but I have chosen 4 couples that I absolutely fell in love with over the past year, and they are my favorite couples from this past year of reading. And my first nomination for Best Pairing comes from The Pairing by Casey McQuiston, and that is Theo and Kit. This is a second chance romance book, which is not something that I typically really enjoy, but McQuiston and Kit and Theo made me fall in love with this setup. I was rooting for Theo and Kit and their happily ever after from the very beginning, and I found them to be just so endearing and so lovely, and I was rooting for them from page 1. Then my next nomination for Best Pairing is Grace and Stephen from Paladin's Grace. I just went on and on about these 2 characters, so I won't repeat myself too much except to say that I absolutely adore these 2 characters. I loved watching them navigate love and their relationship and making that very active choice to risk being hurt again because they cared for the other person so much. So of course, Grace and Stephen had to find their way into my best pairings of 2024 category. My third nomination for Best Pairing of 2024 is Ada and Weston from Swift and Saddled by Lyla Sage. This is the second book in the Rebel Blue Ranch series. And again, typically I tend to favor the first book in a series more so than the second book, but there was just something about Ada and Weston. Again, Ada had been burned before, therefore she was a little bit more wary to love, and Weston was just so willing to meet Ada where she was, and I found that so endearing. There is a particular scene near the end of this book where Ada makes a choice that she then regrets, and she has to kind of eat crow and make her way back to Weston. And I don't want to spoil anything, but I think about that scene quite often because it was the most adorable, heartwarming, and accepting scene of love that I have seen or read about, I think, in a very long time. And yeah, very similar to Grace and Stephen, just that slow burn journey for a character to realize and accept that they are worthy of love, and to then make those choices and actions to navigate that path towards love. It gets me every time, and for that reason, I loved reading Ada and Weston's love story. Then my final nomination for this category follows a very similar path, and that is Hattie and Wit from Brazen and the Beast. Wit in particular was the more reserved character, I would say, in this book, and he really held himself back because, as is often the case in these type of romance book, they think the other person deserves better or more than who they are. And in making that choice for the other person, you are robbing them of the ability to make that choice for themselves. And watching characters come to that realization never gets old, for me at least. So Hattie and Wit I absolutely adored following along with their love story too. But alas, there can only ever be one winner. So my best pairing of 2024 is going to be, drumroll please, Theo and Kit. Again, I think this is one where it was really apparent when I'm talking about the characters. As much as I love Grace and Stephen, as much as I love Ada and Weston, as much as I loved Hattie and Wit, Theo and Kit made me fall in love with a trope that I don't usually like. And that takes a lot of power and a lot of character. And for that reason, Theo and Kit are my best pairing of 2024. And I hope that their happily ever after is just as sweet now as it was on the last page of this book. The next category that I want to talk about today is best plot twist. And this is one that I struggled to talk about last year as well, because I am obviously very, very aware of not spoiling anything, because I never want to spoil a book for someone. So this is going to be very vague and broad. Obviously, a lot of books have a plot twist, and I'm not going to talk about any of the specific twists, but just in general, these nominations all had something that had me almost sitting up, if not literally sitting up and gasping at the way that things turned and the way that things changed in a way that I wasn't expecting. So the first nomination that I have to talk about today is Defiant by Brandon Sanderson. And I don't actually own a physical copy of Defiant, so I brought down my copy of Skyward to stand in as a placeholder. And Defiant is obviously the fourth book in the Skyward series, so I wouldn't even really be able to talk much about it without spoiling the previous books in the series, let alone talking about a plot twist that takes place in the last book. But I think a lot of us have read Sanderson, and I think all of us know about the Sanderlanche that takes place. Sanderson has this way of wrapping up series and books in a way that he takes things in a direction that I have just accepted I'm not going to be able to predict, and I'm just along for the journey. And that was definitely the case with Skyward. The next book that I would like to nominate for best plot twist is The Lions of Al-Rassan. And this is not necessarily like a big epic plot twist, but the conclusion to this book can go one way or the other. And Kay very purposefully left it very vague until like the last moment where he revealed it. So you're flipping through pages thinking, okay, I think it's going this way, but like the way he's writing it, it could very easily have gone the other way. And I thought that was just an incredibly creative, captivating, intriguing, interesting way to end Lions that equally broke my heart. Either way that it was going to break my heart. And Kay just kind of kept you hook, line, and sinker and dragged you along by said hook before he finally revealed what his final big plot point was. So that one really took me aback, and I really enjoyed the conclusion to Lions of Al-Rassan. My next nomination for best plot twist is very similar in that it was the conclusion, it was the end, the way that this author turned things ever so slightly in that I probably should have anticipated that the conclusion was going to be the way that it was. But Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir still took me aback. The ending was so good, same as Lions, but equally it broke my heart, and it broke me a little bit in the best way. It was the best possible ending for this book, but it still took me back a little bit, I would say. And yes, Muir did not hold any punches, and I found the ending to be kind of like a slight little pivot. There was a plot twist at the end that I really enjoyed. Then my fourth nomination is A River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross. Again, the plot twist for this book took place right at the end, so it was a bit of a cliffhanger. And there were hints and bits and pieces throughout this book that I kind of anticipated where it was going and what was going to take place, but I still absolutely loved the way that Ross executed the plot twist at the end of this book. So it absolutely deserves a place within the category for Best Plot Twist of 2024. And then finally, my last nomination for this category is Sunbringer by Hannah Keener. And this plot twist took place, I want to say it was near the beginning of this book. Again, usually I really like the first book in any series, but I think I liked Sunbringer a little bit more than Godkiller, even though all of our characters kind of split up. And one of the characters that we follow encounters something that harkens back to the first book, and assumptions were made in the first book that turned out to be wrong. And I absolutely, again, love the way that Keener executed that plot twist. It was epic, it was amazing, and I'm just going to say it, Sunbringer wins my best plot twist of 2024 because I love the way that it harkened back to the first book. It raised the stakes of this second book, and it was just really well done. Godkiller did have a few plot twists of its own, but yes, Sunbringer is getting the nomination and the win for Best Plot Twist of 2024. I'm sorry, the sun is now setting. I did not win the race against time, but I am being blinded by that setting sun. And like that, daylight has left us, but I've roped in some ambient mood lighting, and we are just going to roll with it into the 8th category of the 2024 Whiskies, which is Best Line. And I have 4 nominations that I want to talk about today. The first one is from Sailing to Sarantium by Gavriel K. And the line is, "But what did one own if life, if love could be taken away to darkness? Was it all not just a loan, a leasehold, transitory as candles?" And it's that ending, that transitory as candles, that like hit me deep down in the gut of my stomach that I just, oh, I love it. Kay has a way with words. It's such simple phrasing, but such poignant phrasing. And I mean, Sailing to Sarantium was full of really good quotes. Some of them were a bit too revealing that I didn't want to nominate them because it is like a glimpse to my soul. But that one of life and love being transitory as candles really spoke to me. And one thing I love about Kay, and one thing that I do want to preface nominating this quote with, is that just because something is brief doesn't make it any less worthy. I am very much a proponent that something doesn't have to be forevermore to have a really serious and lasting impact on your life. The brevity of life or love can sometimes make it all the sweeter, and there is no timeline that something has to meet before it qualifies as having a true and solid impact on your life. Something can be as transitory as candles and impact who you are and who you will be and become. And that is a theme and something that Kay touches on throughout his bibliography. That is just one of the many reasons why I absolutely adore him as an author. But the second nomination for the best line of 2024 is from Lyrial by Garth Nix. And again, there were a handful of quotes that felt really poignant throughout this book. It is a book that is about life and death and the meaning of life and death and the afterlife. But the quote that I chose, the line that I chose from this book is, "Be assured that any hurt to your spirit will pass in time. It is the nature of death to take, but the nature of life to give." And I think that's just such a beautiful sentiment. My third nomination for this category is from Paladin's Grace by T. Kingfisher, because of course I chose a quote from Paladin's Grace. The quote that I have selected for this category is, again, a little bit of a somber one, but it is, "Relief feels like happiness if you don't know the difference." And it is Grace who thinks that thought in their mind. And Grace has such a heartbreaking journey, such a heartbreaking story, that it just felt a little bit like a sucker punch when I read that line. Relief feels like happiness if you don't know the difference. And to that point, Grace doesn't know the difference, but I think a really beautiful part of that book and that series is that she learns the difference. So I really liked the simplicity of that quote and just all that it alluded to and the emotions that it evoked for me. And then finally, the fourth nomination for Best Line of 2024 is going to be from The Lions of Al-Rassan by Guy Gavriel K. And it is, "I think that I should know you in a pitch black room. I think I would know you anywhere near me in the world. Is that answer enough? Or too much of one, will you say?" And again, just such a beautiful, simple-esque quote, and it is so representative of the two characters who are speaking to each other in that moment. And I've purposefully left off the names that are mentioned within that excerpt, just because if you read The Lions of Al-Rassan, I don't want to reveal anything for you. But it is such a beautiful, beautiful concept and premise of, I would know you anywhere. I would know you in a pitch black room. I would know you anywhere in the world. And again, the way that Kay depicts love and relationships, the messiness of them, the realisticness of them. So for that reason, that quote from The Lions of Al-Rassan is my best line of 2024. My next category is Best Nonfiction Read of 2024, and the first one is The Sea Winds by Eric Alabi. This is a local history book, and it's talking about the Bay of Fundy, and it begins way back in, I think, the 1700s. I don't think it goes as far back as the 1600s, but it begins in the 1700s with the exploration of the Bay of Fundy right up until the present day. And it talks about the different shipwrecks that occur within this small basin of water where the Atlantic Ocean comes in between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And I just loved, one, the simplicity of the title, The Sea Winds, but then also the respect and reverence that Alabi speaks about the water with. You can tell he is someone who has great respect for fishermen, for folks who make their life on the waters, for folks who lost their life within the waters. It was a great look at local history about a body of water that I can basically look out my window and see. My next nomination for Best Nonfiction Read falls within a very similar vein, and that is A History of the World in 12 Shipwrecks. And while The Sea Winds had a very conversational tone and focused on a very specific body of water throughout a couple hundred years of history, A History of the World in 12 Shipwrecks takes a much larger look. It does read much more like a history text compared to The Sea Winds, which was a very conversational tone book, like I had said. But if you have an interest in shipwrecks and the marine history of our world, I would definitely recommend A History of the World in 12 Shipwrecks. Then the third nomination for Best Nonfiction Read is a memoir about grief, and it is I Promise It Won't Always Hurt Like This by Claire Mackintosh. And I really, really appreciated the brutal honesty that Mackintosh writes with. The grief that they experienced is tremendous and heartbreaking. Throughout the book, Mackintosh talks about how no one's grief journey is going to be the same, and there's no right way to grieve. And also, it's okay if you're not receptive to the message she is trying to tell you at that point in your grief journey. And sometimes they can come across as a little bit hoity-toity, and that was not the case with I Promise It Won't Always Hurt Like This. My fourth nomination for Best Nonfiction Book is another book about grief, and that is Bittersweet by Susan Cain. And again, while I Promise It Won't Always Hurt Like This was more of a memoir, was more of a personal collection of grief and Mackintosh's journey, Bittersweet by Susan Cain takes the more analytical and scientific approach, I guess you could say. There were certain sections throughout Bittersweet that didn't really resonate with me, that didn't really connect. It almost did feel a little bit like the medieval humors of how we need a little bit of each to feel and to be whole, but I still really enjoyed Bittersweet. And then finally, my last nonfiction nomination is Prisoners of Geography, 10 Maps That Explain Everything About the World by Tim Marshall. This is a book that I've already spoken about quite a lot on my channel, and that is because I really, really enjoyed it. Prisoners of Geography was published about a decade ago, so there is some information within the book that is a little bit out of date now. There are also some possibilities that Marshall talks about within Prisoners of Geography that have become our reality. So I found it to be an incredibly informative book. It also had that more conversational tone, which is something that I really appreciate in nonfiction books, especially nonfiction books that tackle heavier subject matter like Prisoners of Geography did. All that said, my winner for the best nonfiction read of 2024 is going to be The Sea Winds by Eric Alaby. I feel like it was probably a little bit obvious just in the way that I was talking about this book, but I truly, truly fell in love with this book. And again, it's one of those books that I wasn't expecting to really love as much as I did, but I just found it to be an entertaining and informative read, which is exactly what I am looking for when I pick up a nonfiction book. We have finally made it to the penultimate category, and this one is a bit of a fun one because this is for the best cover of 2024. And because this is a little bit superficial and perhaps even more so than the other categories, very personal to my tastes and interest, I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to get through this category a little bit quicker. So the first nomination is Servant of Earth by Sarah Hawley. And this is a book that 100%, it is the cover that drew me in first. I was scrolling through the new arrivals section on Libby. I spied this cover, and that is what made me click on it realized it was by Sarah Hawley, who is an author that I really enjoy. And yes, I just find this cover to be so intriguing and beautiful, and it really drew me in. The next nomination is actually a book that I've already spoken about, but I kind of skimmed over how beautiful I found the cover, and that is Warrior of the Wild by Trisha Levenseller. This is such a simple cover, but I think because every element they just nailed out of the park, that's why I find it so beautiful. Like, the detail on the axe head there is stunning, and yeah, I love the typeface. I love everything about this cover. I find it to be very beautiful, and it drew me in when I first saw it. My next nomination for Best Cover of 2024 is A Study in Drowning by Ava Reed. And I haven't actually spoken about this book throughout the Whiskies because I was left a little bit disappointed by A Study in Drowning. But again, this is a book that initially drew me in because of the cover. And as I'm looking at the cover here again for the first time in about half a year or so, it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. I absolutely love it. Then my fourth nomination for Best Cover of this past year is God Killer by Hannah Kaner. Again, I discovered this book and this series because I was scrolling through books online, as I do, and I was immediately drawn in by this stunning cover with the full moon and with this stag being kind of entwined in branches and trees. Yeah, I just found this one to be very beautiful. And then my final nomination for Best Cover of 2024 is a little bit of an outlier, and that's because it's The Pairing by Casey McQuiston. This, while it is an arc, is basically identical to what the final cover looked like, just except this band on the side here. And again, I find this cover to be pretty simple, but they nailed every element out of the park. And I absolutely adore the way that the shirts on Theo and Kit are also like little maps. Is this gonna focus? Yeah, like I just find that to be so beautiful, so well done. So I loved that. Now I need to focus me again. So those are my 5 nominations for Best Cover of 2024. And honestly, as I have them all gathered here in front of me, I'm wondering if I selected the right one, because my winner was God Killer by Hannah Kaner, but A Study in Drowning and also Servant of Earth are so stunning. But I think I still have to give it to God Killer. I need to go with my gut. This feels, while it isn't a witchy book, I think with the full moon, with the earthy elements, it feels a little bit witchy. A Study in Drowning gives kind of ghostly vibes, and then Servant of Earth also gives witchy vibes, and those are vibes that I absolutely love. But yes, I'm gonna stick with my gut, and I'm gonna say the best cover of 2024 is God Killer. Yes. Maybe a close second is Servant of Earth. A close second tie, Servant of Earth and A Study in Drowning. Yeah. And now, before we move on to my final category, which is the best overall read and my whiskey of 2024, I do have a few honorable mentions that I want to just take a quick second to go through. And the first one is When All Is Said by Anne Griffin. This is a contemporary literary fiction book that I really couldn't find a place for within the categories I had laid out, but it is easily hands down one of my favorite books from this year. I read this back in May. I finished it in May, and I listened to the audiobook for When All Is Said. And it is a book that I find myself thinking about on a semi-regular basis. This is a book about death and the meaning of life and what our legacy is or should be when we depart this earthly realm. It's a very, very heavy book, but hands down, one of the best books that I read in 2024, one that I will carry with me for a very long time. And the narrator for When All Is Said, I think is the best narrator I have ever listened to. He brought the protagonist to life in ways that I did not anticipate or expect. And this book had me crying within like chapter 1, chapter 2. But I've spoken about this book before on my channel, so I'll leave it there for now. But When All Is Said by Anne Griffin is a phenomenal, phenomenal book. So it is my first honorable mention. My second honorable mention is Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. And this is a young adult fantasy. And I discovered Margaret Rogerson back in 2023 for the first time. And I just found her characters, and I find her characters to be so endearing and lovable. I found Sorcery of Thorns to be a really intriguing premise. It was an amazing young adult fantasy. I believe I gave it 4.5 stars or somewheres around there. There's a little bit of mystery, there's a little bit of intrigue, there is a romantic element, and yes, it was the perfect young adult fantasy for me. Then finally, my third honorable mention is Time to Shine by Rachel Reed. And this is a contemporary hockey romance by a fellow Maritimer. So I didn't realize that Rachel Reed was a Maritimer. She's from Nova Scotia until after I finished Time to Shine. And it just made me love the book even more because I have read a few hockey romances and I do find them entertaining, but I do find it particularly grating when you can tell that the author doesn't know much about hockey or didn't at least do some research about hockey. And there's at least one that I read where you don't even find out what position the male hockey player plays. That is not the case with Time to Shine. The reason I adored this book so much is because you can tell that Rachel Reed grew up watching hockey. She knows what she's talking about. And there's actually bits of the game that become part of the book. We are following 2 teammates, and yes, I absolutely loved Time to Shine, and I will be picking up more by Rachel Reed. And so, with those being my honorable mentions, all that is left is to crown the Whiskey my best overall read of 2024. And once again, I think it's a little bit obvious with the way I have spoken about this book and this author throughout the course of this very long video, what my best overall read will be for 2024 and what is deserving of the Whiskey. But that is, of course, Paladin's Grace by T. Kingfisher. This book took me by such surprise, and I sped through it so quickly and then promptly went out and read the other books in the series as fast as I possibly could. And the only reason that I don't own a physical copy of Paladin's Grace is because I know the books are being re-released by a traditional publisher in 2025. And I want all of the covers to match on my shelf. So I've held back from buying physical copies of these books, even though I adore these OG self-published covers. And I think there's a part of me that always will. And Paladin's Grace didn't even win Best Cover for 2024, but it has won my Whiskey, my best overall read, because I can't go on about this book enough. If I had 2 full hours, I would talk your ear off about this book, and anyone in my circle of friends and loved ones, I've probably already talked your ear off about this series, these characters, this world, because I love it so, so, so much. And I hope that we will get news about the 5th book's publication in 2025. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. But as is the premise with the Whiskies concept, my best overall read has been crowned the Whiskey, and this year's Whiskey is continuing on from last year's Whiskey, and that is another Bareface Whiskey, except this one is their second in the Canadian Wilderness series. And I have not tried this whiskey, so we're gonna try it together for the very first time. And I remember seeing the first whiskey in their Wilderness series out about this time last year, I think. And the whole concept of this series is taking an element from the wilderness somewheres across Canada and infusing it into the whiskey to give it a different flavor. And the 01 had mushrooms in it, which I hate mushrooms, so that wasn't my cup of tea. But the number 2 here is the Mittelnatch Island release. And this is an island off the Pacific coast. And I believe they've put sea salt in the barrels or at some point during the aging process to infuse it with like a more salty finish. Yes, so it is aged in French oak X Chardonnay casks, and it is then blended with alligator charred X Burgundy casks for a deep honey spice, and carefully proofed with distilled water from maple smoked salt for a sweet but savory finish. So this is the bottle here. And after the ordeal that has been filming this video, with the number of times that my camera battery has died, it's also pitch black outside now. We're fully in artificial lighting. I am very much looking forward to my first drink of New Year's Eve and to toast the end of 2024 and what has been an absolutely fantastic reading year. I have not posted as many videos as I would have liked. I've not spoken about my reading throughout the year as it's been happening, but I am hopeful and optimistic for 2025. That was a little bit anticlimactic, but yes. Ooh, it smells really, really nice. And so here we are. I have put some ice in this glass here. It's a very light whiskey, lighter than first appearances in this bottle, but it smells very sweet. And I guess that would be the maple part of the maple smoked salt, but yes, cheers. Yeah, I mean, it's Bareface whiskey. I have spoken about that before, about how I love it. It's a quite light whiskey, as you might assume with this color. It feels lighter than the regular Bareface. And then there's the smoky finish. It's very lingering. It's in the aftertaste. I get a little bit of the smoke. If you like whiskeys from the Scottish Highlands with that peaty flavor, I think you would really like this. It's not quite as pronounced as, say, some of those Scottish whiskeys from like, where is it? Islay? I think that's how you pronounce that island. Or Gunn has done an Islay cask beer, and that Rauch beer, which is a German type of beer that has that very smoky flavor. It's not as pronounced as that, but there is that lingering smokiness at the end. But yes, that's my previous beverage industry experience coming through with those tasting notes. I hope that you have enjoyed my mini review of this whiskey, and my dozens of mini reviews for the books that I've talked about today, because that is it. That is all I have to say about the 2024 Whiskies. It was an amazing reading year. I had a lot of 5-star reads. I had a handful of like 2-star reads this year too, because I really challenged myself with reading outside of my typical genres, but overall had an amazing reading year. I hope that all of you had a great reading year too. But that is going to be it from me for now. Thank you so very much for watching this video, and I will be back soon with a new one. Bye for now, and Happy New Year.